Hello everybody, this is Nick, this is Edropian, and in this video I will be comparing the performance of two Kings, the 1080 Ti and the 3090 on Rainbow Six Siege Vulkan. Let's do this. Για ελληνικούς υπότιτλους, αυτό που θα πρέπει να κάνετε θα είναι να έρθετε πάνω στο player σας, να κάνετε κλικ στο εικονίδιο που γράφει CC και με το που το κάνετε αυτό θα δείτε ότι θα σας βγάλει αρχικά αγγλικούς υπότιτλους. Για να πάρουμε τώρα ελληνικούς υπότιτλους θα πρέπει να κάνουμε κλικ στο γρανάζι, να έρθουμε εδώ που λέει Subtitles CC και κάνοντας κλικ εδώ πάνω να πατήσουμε μετά στο Auto Translate και να επιλέξουμε τη γλώσσα που επιθυμούμε μέσα από όλες αυτές, αλλά στη δικιά μας περίπτωση τα ελληνικά. Με το που κάνουμε κλικ έχουμε πλέον ελληνικούς υπότιτλους και είστε σε θέση να δείτε αυτό το βίντεο, ναι μεν τραβηγμένο στα αγγλικά, αλλά με ελληνικούς υπότιτλους. Πάμε να συνεχίσουμε τώρα. Okay, before we jump into the graphs and the overall comparison, I should mention that if you want to learn more about the system specs, the overall setup, and the testing rig and the information on the graphs I will be providing, you should watch prior to this video the reference video I have uploaded here on my channel on YouTube, to which you will be always welcome to subscribe and follow up with my future uploads, in which I am explaining everything you need to know to avoid confusion and increase your understanding of what follows. In addition to what I just said, I should point out that in this video I will be focusing on the main performance differences between the two cards, and if you want a more detailed video about the 1080 Ti or the 3090, you should watch the independent videos I have uploaded, in which I am focusing on their individual performance with a more in-depth approach. I will be trying to keep this video as short as possible, so let's get moving to the meat and potatoes now. When it comes down to 1080p or low in Vulkan, our limiting factor, our main limiting factor is our CPU, the 8700K in our scenario always. But let's see up to what extent, shall we? When we first saw these graphs on my video in which I was analyzing the 1080 Ti performance, I told you that while we tend to be CPU bound, we are actually not, and I was right. While someone who focuses only on the averages will say that we only get 20 FPS improvement with the 3090 over the 1080 Ti, will be actually right on that. The truth is that we get more than that, and this is why I will always keep saying to you that focusing on the averages is by far the worst thing you can do to yourselves. Paying attention on the FPS tables will tell you why immediately, and if you happen to not be able to understand why, let me help you with that. While yes, being on the 1080p or low scenario brings more our 8700K CPU on the spotlight here, the truth is that the 3090 provides the necessary horsepower to our system, which leads us on a pure CPU bound scenario, out of which we can squeeze all this CPU has to offer, with virtually zero interferences from the GPU in the end results we get, while that was never the case with the 1080 Ti. The most important here is for us to focus on the uplift we get with the 3090 on our minimum and low percentiles. There, our FPS values are around 80 FPS greater than before, and this is of huge importance, especially on a competitive title like the R6 is. But in order for you to understand why, I should swap to our input lag and until display times graphs to explain it there. Before I move forward here, you should pay attention when reading and comparing these graphs, because they are not on the same scale and they might be a little confusing at first. What I was about to explain here is that when our minimum and lows stay as high as possible, then we retain ourselves above a certain input lag and sync barrier, and the more stressing moments we face while gaming won't find us spiking to the levels we did with the 1080 Ti. That means, in plain English, more accurate representation of what we see on our monitors in terms of time, and of course, more accurate input commands from us, based always on what we see on our monitors. Like aiming for a head at its actual position the moment we click to shoot at it, in contrast to where we see it be at the moment. As you can clearly see here from the until display times tables, we find ourselves with an insanely snappy system behavior with the 3090, where we virtually see a frame on our monitors immediately after it was produced, and that is what we are actually after. In addition to that, we also see an improvement of 2 milliseconds on the input lag we get, which, while not substantial, it is considerable and welcome. But let's see what happens when we max out the graphic settings on the 1080p with both the cards, where our CPU will fade from the picture. Now, 1080p max is where things start to become really interesting for us, but let's see why. No, there's nothing wrong with your audio, guys. I intentionally let you digest what you see on your monitors here before I start explaining the obvious. While with the 1080 Ti we were in a pure GPU bound scenario here, we see that the 3090 brings more our CPU into the front line here, making it function double time, and that is not an accident, but the result of an at least 2 times more power under the hood. While still GPU bound even with the 3090, proving to us once again that the 8700K is more than enough for us, we witness an uplift in performance across all percentiles, which is more than 100%, while at the same time our frame times and our produced FPS remain with a low, if non-existent deviation. And this is amazing to see because it actually means our 3090 can deal with a given task pretty easily. As a side note here, I should repeat myself and say that I would prefer to see our lows and minimum staying above 165 FPS, but you can't ignore the fact that we are facing a game-changing situation here, and I will stick to that. Let's see now how what we see here translates in terms of input lag and until display times on our following graphs. I believe that the picture here speaks by itself, right? Even by watching at the graphs, we can witness the smoother overall performance here, and the tables say the actual story. Dropping for the most of our samples for more than 5 milliseconds in our until display times is a serious gain in performance. And having 11 to 15 milliseconds gains in our input lag is amazing, considering always that we find ourselves in a scenario where we ask the GPU to provide the most for us, and considering also that, as we saw until now on all my previous videos, when we do that, things go south pretty fast. And with that, let's move forward and see what story has the 1440p resolution to tell us. Entering now the 1440p all low, we have the opportunity to see the level up to which the 3090 performance exceeds that of the 1080 Ti. And even if we find ourselves partially CPU bound on the 3090 side, we are still able to get 80 to 100% uplift in our FPS results here again. At the same time, we see our FPS deviation spiking too, but that is not enough for us to consider, mainly because we find ourselves even on our minimum FPS value to be above 165 FPS, and in specific we find ourselves to get a minimum value of 230 FPS, which is by all means whooping, considering that our minimum value with the 3090 is somewhat the average we get with the 1080 Ti in a no-low bare-bones graphics setting scenario. Moving now to our input lag and until display times graphs, we can see all I said up to this point to be pictured here plainly, having close to 3 milliseconds gains in our until display times for the majority of our samples and our input lag reduced by 5 milliseconds. And what makes these time gains important is the fact which I also mentioned earlier, and this is that we find ourselves in a bare-bones graphics aside scenario where the main stress on the GPU comes from the resolution itself and the number of the pixels which has to be addressed, proving to us again and again that the last thing we need to focus here is our 8700K CPU in order for us to find ourselves in the range we want as our minimum to be when playing on a 144Hz monitor. Moving to 1440p max now, while in comparison with the 1080 Ti, the 3090 delivers a jaw-dropping performance, it still fails to deliver up to our expectations for 2021. And again, as I said already, the comparison of the 3090 with the 1080 Ti here is jaw-dropping. What we get here as a result is a performance uplift of more than 100% on average, and up to 200% on our lows and minimums, and that is not something to take lightly. Unfortunately though, even with that uplift in performance, with the 3090, we won't find ourselves reaching our desired FPS outcome of 144 FPS on 1440p with maxed out graphics settings. And that not even on our P99, and we will stay below our targeted FPS range continuously, with our lows diving down to 90 FPS. Now, while this is enough for casual 60 FPS gaming, let's be honest to ourselves and say that most people who have a 1440p monitor nowadays, they are having refresh rates up to 144 Hz. And beyond that, there is also one more important factor to consider when I'm saying that the 3090 is not enough to provide the absolute, and while it is a card released nowadays, it won't make it to address the actual needs of nowadays gamers. What most people miss is that virtually every single monitor on the market which has a 1440p resolution and 144 Hz as its refresh ratio, when playing below that native refresh ratio, induces stupidly bad gray-to-gray pixel response times, which leads to what we call ghosting, and most people, including myself, can't live with that. This is something which actively will force a user to reduce the graphic settings in order to raise the produced FPS and get rid of that side effect of having lower FPS. So, no, you won't have me cheering for a card which was meant to address our nowadays needs, and it comes short on that. With that price tag and released in a market with pretty much defined expectations established by a lot by Nvidia itself. Is this a good GPU? Of course it is, by all means it is, especially when you compare it with the past, but we don't invest our money to feel better according to the past. We invest our money to address our actual needs and in order to look into the future, right? With my point clarified, I think we can now proceed with our input lag and until display times graphs for 1440p max. Let's do this. By watching at what you see on your monitors, I feel that words are not enough to describe the actual differences of the two cards. Performance-wise, it is like comparing night and day, with 50% reduction in our input lag times and again slightly more than 50% reduction in our until display times. 3090 proves itself to be an actual generation leap as a card, something that even 2080 Ti was never able to consider claiming. But there is room for further improvement, and as consumers, when we are asked to invest that sick amount of money on hardware, we owe it to ourselves to say that what we are provided with is not enough to meet our actual needs, and that companies like Nvidia and AMD should give up their intellectual BS and come up with actual answers for their market. Alright, and before we move forward with our concluding bars chart, I think it is worth taking a closer look on what happens when we find ourselves under 1440p max but on DirectX 11 now. Let's take a look. As of now, in all our previous benchmark videos in which I was explaining everything in depth, we have established an understanding of the fact that DirectX 11 is an inefficient API, and that because it focuses more on loading the GPU while at the same time keeping in a way our CPU dormant. With that being said, in DirectX 11 we can see that our actual gains are there, but less on our lows, and while our median and average values present gains of up to 100% plus, our lows can't follow up the same way as they did in Vulkan, and our gains appear to be more linear across all percentiles. The uplift we witness in CPU activity on the 3090 side is not there because of the DirectX 11, but there because of the more stress the 3090 is able to provide on our CPU due to the higher FPS it produces. Moving now to our input lag and until display times graphs, and keeping in mind that DirectX 11 is focusing on loading our GPU, it is not a surprise to see our input lag times halved here on the 3090 side and our until display times down by 2/3 of what we get here with the 1080 Ti. What needs to be said before I move forward is that while we witness insane gains as a result of the 3090's horsepower, our times remain high, and that is bad. Awesome, and as we find ourselves one step before the end of this specific video, let's take a look, let's summarize and take a closer look on our final concluding bar chart to see the whole picture of what we have been through so far. Let's do this. Alright folks, this is the end of our today's video, and that was the performance comparison between 1080 Ti and 3090, and I really believe that I did my best to provide as much value as possible and as many information as possible, so you can end up with your own conclusions also if you prefer to ignore everything I said so far in this video. But before we leave for today for this video, I'd like you to click the follow button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon, and leave a comment behind, leave a thumb up, etc. Because as you know by now, interaction with my videos is what helps the most because of the YouTube algorithm. That's a fact, guys. And I will be seeing you on my social media pages, on Facebook, which is my main base, or any other profile I have out there, and of course I might see you also if you wanna see me playing games, etc. on my Twitch channel or any other channel. You will be able to find all the links right below in the description, and I'll see you on the next one, guys.